Hi, hello, I'm Kevin Ryan, and this is Tom Ryan Remembers. Tom Ryan and Barbara Engelhardt are here, and today's topic on August 1st is Marie DeVries Ryan, which is Tom's mother, correct?
Correct. The reason I realized making all these tapes, no one knows my mother that's alive today. I'm the only one left. I'm almost 90, and I would like to honor my mother by telling how wonderful she was to me. Very loving mother. Her name, Marie DeVries. DeVries is a Dutch name. It's part of Holland, is in the Netherlands, is Friesland. And they are DeVries, which is of Friesland. So they came to America, and they were unusual. They were Catholics. And so my mother was a very devout Catholic. And uh, and if they were going to marry, they always wanted to marry a Catholic, and there weren't very many Dutch Catholics. So almost all she and her sisters married Irish Catholics. There were a lot of Irishmen around. So that's how her name became Marie DeVries Ryan. She met my father because she was a one-room school teacher, and the taxes that the farmers nearby could have their taxes reduced by housing, giving room and board to the teacher. They were usually very young girls just out of high school. And my mother got to be a teacher by passing a test when she was a senior in high school. And she got a high enough score so that she got a teacher's certificate. And then teachers, of course, were fired when they got married because they knew that if they got pregnant and had a baby, they could no way could they have room and board at a nearby dairy farm and continue teaching. So the only way to make teaching a career was to be an old maid, married. There were a few of those, but this was a job for young girls. And they had to contend with the students from the nearby dairy farms. And some of them were boys whose fathers kept pulling them out of school to do farm work, and they didn't graduate on time. And they were almost as old as my mother. And handling the discipline with these big farm boys can be a problem. I don't know, she never really said why, but she didn't like being a teacher very much. So at this nearby farm, the McGrains were cousins of my father's, and he didn't have any boy brothers. So he would go over to the McGrains and he would play with the kids there. So he kind of grew up with these kids, and he now had a car, so he'd still come and visit them. And so he got to meet the new school teacher, and they end up getting married. He was Catholic, and she was Catholic, and so that was important. They had a simple wedding at St. Joseph Church, which was German Catholic. In those days, Catholic churches had ethnic groups that lived close by, and almost everybody in the church was of that ethnic group, and often the sermons were given in German in this case. Well, German isn't Dutch, but it was the closest thing that they could find. There wasn't any Dutch Catholic church, and so they came back out to the farmhouse and had a very simple dress and simple wedding, and they were married. Now, my father was a postal clerk, and so they moved to Waukegan, and they were able to, after a short time living in an apartment, they saved up enough money to put a down payment on a little cottage. It was on Wisconsin Avenue. And I always told my children that I was born in a log cabin. Well, it wasn't a log cabin. They knew that, but it was a small, it didn't even have a basement in it. And my folks
So
saw
wait,
that.
wait, wait, wait. You weren't born in a hospital?
Well, I was born in a hospital, yes.
Okay,
I
okay.
mean, I came home to this little cottage without a basement, with only 2 bedrooms. And but it was important to own your own home. And the reason my parents were able to buy a home because my mother worked at the courthouse in the county courthouse records department as a clerk and made a little money. And so they could pool their money and buy this, make the down payment on this house. I I think they were able to do that because she did not get pregnant. Uh, they were married for 7 years before I was born. And my mother, later on, when I was a teenager, she called me into the living room. I remember that. And she wanted to tell me to have a talk about sex. And this was very difficult for her. And it really surprised me. But she told me that when she got married, nobody told her anything about sex. She knew nothing. And it was so hard learning that she didn't want me to go through that. And so my father wouldn't do this with me, but she thought I should learn something about sex and wanted to know if I had any questions. Well, by then I knew quite a bit about it. I think more than she did when she got married. But it worked out. It was a loving thing because it was not easy for her to do that.
Yeah.
But it made me suspect that she had a condition with the stories that she told me that her hymen was so elastic or so tough that it would not break at the time of her marriage. And she had this stiff, and it was very difficult to have sexual intercourse. And that was probably the reason that she didn't have it. She didn't get pregnant by the time till for 7 years. But my father always said that he was very poor growing up, and they ate a lot of pancakes. And he said the reason he lost his teeth when he was only in his 20s is because he ate too many pancakes. So he blamed it on the pancakes, and he had to have his teeth replaced. And when he had his teeth pulled and artificial teeth, false teeth inserted, he said my wife got pregnant. My mother got pregnant. So he blamed it on the teeth replacement.
So how old were they when they got married?
20.
20?
They were both born in 1900, 1901. And this was like 1921. Uh-huh. And then I was born in 1930. Uh-huh. So this was a wonderful event. And my mother was very happy that I was born. And she was a very loving mother. But she had to contend with eczema that I had. It's a skin disease that often in children, and it's very messy, and you itch, and then I would itch even as a baby, and I would get it bleeding, and so in order to have it heal, they had to tie my hands down with gloves on, and then they would tie my hands to the safety pin them to the sheets in the baby bed, and so I wouldn't make the eczema grow. So she had to contend with that. And then when I was like 2 years old, I had a terrible experience with breathing. They thought I had pneumonia, and they rushed me to the hospital, and I met this doctor. He was Dr. Smith. He was the only black doctor in Lake County, and he attended to me. So my mother said he had these big black hands, and and I was just a little baby, and he declared me asthmatic. I had asthma, and it's allergy caused, they think, a disease. They still don't know exactly what causes it, but it's not germ caused anyway. And I didn't have pneumonia, but asthma stayed with me as a disabler most of my youth. By the time I was 16, seemed to disappear. Puberty seemed, again, cause and effect. I went through puberty and then the asthma went away. They don't know what causes it, but maybe puberty makes it go away. Anyway, she had to contend with that as I was growing up, and I'm sure it wasn't easy for her. I remember once they would when I'd have these asthma attacks, they'd put me in a big bed and put pillows around me so I could kind of half sit up and half lay down. And I was gasping for breath. And I was just a little kid, and I started to cry. I was so frustrated that I couldn't breathe. And my mother would say, "Don't cry, Tommy. It only makes it worse." So I remembered that. And I think she was suffering right along with me. And she knew that crying doesn't help. It only makes it worse. So I think that was kind of a lesson that I remembered the rest of my life. Don't cry over spilt milk and so on. So I went on, and she was very loving about it. And I didn't have another sibling until my sister was born, and that was 7 years later. So they had a child after 7 years of marriage, and then a second child after another 7 years of marriage. So I was like an only child till I was pretty well grown up.
So she had a baby at 27 and then 34?
Yes, and then
third one, right?
the last one when she was 40. It was 10 years after I was born in 1930, and my last sister was born in 1940. And I can remember her calling me in again when I was just 10 years old and telling me quietly, no one else was in the house, she said, "We're going to have a baby, and I wanted you to know that a baby's going to come and live at our house." And I thought, "Oh, that's wonderful." She says, "But I don't want you to tell anybody. I don't want you running out in the street and saying, 'We're going to have a baby, we're going to have a baby,' or anything like that. Just keep it to yourself and don't tell anybody." So I didn't. I was very obedient, and my mother would walk to the store often. We only had one car, and although my father usually took the bus to work, she walked to the store often. And so she would walk down the street on our block of Cornelia Avenue in Waukegan and walk down the street, and the neighbor saw her. And so my neighbor told her daughter, Janet Welch, she said, "Janet, Mrs. Ryan's going to have a baby." "Oh," Janet said. Janet runs out into the street. "Oh, Tommy, your mother's going to have a baby." And I went home. I said to my mother, "You said not to tell anybody, and you went and told Mrs. Welch, who lives a block away, way down the street." And she said, "I didn't tell Mrs. Welch. She just knew. She found out about it." So anyway, that was another mistake I made. I didn't know what pregnancy was. I was only 10 years old. Anyway, so then there were the three of us kids that she had to take care of. So they were lucky to be able to buy that little 2-bedroom bungalow on Wisconsin Avenue where we lived. And she worked before I was born, and they saved up the money, and they got the basement dug with the help of her father. Her father was a builder, and he had built a house next door to the one that they bought. And so he could not only build, but farm. He was a very handy man. And he rented that out to different family members through the years. He was talking to us about getting the basement under the bungalow. So he said, "You holler Joe Roos, and Joe will dig it for you. And then when he gets done, you tell him that your father-in-law, Edward DeVries, out there in Gurnee, you know him, don't you? Yeah. He'll pay you." and uh, the guy that dug the basement knew that he owed money to my grandfather that he hadn't paid him, and he was supposed to agreed to pay him, but never did pay him. So he never did go out to get to the farm to collect the money. So we got the basement dug for free, and my grandfather contributed I guess it was a pile of hay that he had bought and never paid for. Anyway, that bungalow was our home through my youth, but it wasn't big enough, and they bought. They were very much into buying their own home, and they would struggle and save money so that they would be able to do that. And they bought a home on Cornelia Avenue. It only had 2 bedrooms as well, but it was bigger and had a basement. And so they moved out of that log cabin. It wasn't a log cabin, but the little bungalow on Wisconsin Avenue. But we always had cousins living next door in the big house that Grandpa had built. And that was true of the whole DeVries, all the girls. There were 7 daughters, and my mother was the oldest. And they all wanted to own their own homes, and it was a tough, difficult to get the money together for the down payment and then to make the mortgage payments so that they could own their own homes. But I think almost all of them did. But they all bought homes close to each other. Now this was the second home. This cost $8,500, and my parents bought it. It was just across 2 doors away from the one that I went to when I was in kindergarten. And the house, that second house, we bought my parents bought during World War II. And house prices were rising because they hadn't built any houses, and there was a short supply. So they paid the mortgage was for $8,500, and that was so. It's a fancy house that even though they sold the little cottage for what equity they had in it, they were worried that they wouldn't be able to pay. And during the Depression, a lot of people lost their homes because they couldn't make the payments, and the bank had to foreclose. Now that's my mother and father, and my mother, as you can see there, was the shortest one in the family. My father was 6 feet tall. I don't know how old. My 5'11" he was, and I don't know how old. But my mother, that's the house next door behind them, and that's the one that Marilyn Haldeman lived in, and she grew up there, and I married her, so I married the girl next door. But I want to stay with my mother and talk about her and my father living in this house that they really couldn't afford, and so it was a real struggle. And they had a fireplace in the living room, and it was pretty fancy compared to anything any of our relatives had even. So they're very proud of having the house. I went to school from that house, mostly to Catholic school, but again, because I had asthma and I was kind of sickly, I didn't go to the Catholic school, which was a mile away, and I'd have to either take a bus or walk. And so for the first grade, kindergarten and first grade, I went to the West School, which was just a couple of blocks away, and I had to walk to school. And being kind of timid and afraid, I didn't want to walk by this dog. The dog was just a couple of doors down, and he would run out of the house and bark at the fence. And he couldn't get at me because there was a fence there, but he'd stick his nose right between the slats in the fence and just growl and bark, and it frightened me. And I would come home and I'd tell my mother, I can't get by the dog. And she said, you've got to walk to school. I can't walk you to school every day. And so you're going to have to walk. But I was crying. I didn't want to go. So my mother picked up a stick. Now she never spanked me but there was a stick that fell off a tree that was just a kind of a little whip like. And she picked that up off the ground and she started swinging it at me. And I got more afraid of my mother than I was the dog. And I ran down the street and went to school. And the dog barked at me, but from then on, I wasn't afraid of the dog. But that's how I was a pretty timid, probably overprotected, spoiled little kid. And my mother realized that I needed to be toughened up. And so being a farm girl and my father, they both grew up on farms. They had to be able to milk a cow when they were very young, and they did a lot of hard work, and you couldn't be soft and whiny like I was, and they had to do something about that. So they began to force me to go out and play with the other kids and so on. And I was slow growing up, but I did, and I did eventually go to Catholic school, and for second grade, and by third grade into Catholic school, I remember I took the diocesan exam, and that was given, I realize now, to test the teachers, who most of them were nuns. They were all nuns, but they didn't go to college, and they would go in the summertime back to the mother house at Cincinnati, Wisconsin, and they were the Dominican nuns of Cincinnati, Wisconsin, and they would learn something at their mother house during the summer, but they didn't have any formal college education. And so to check them, the diocese, that's the Catholic bishop, would have this test, and all the Catholic schools gave the diocesan test once a year. And if the teacher got a high enough grade, really, it was from the teacher, then it looked like she was teaching us what we were supposed to learn, and she was a good teacher. And she would get the results of these tests, and it was kind of a learning experience for her to see what her children didn't know and did know. And so I remember I got the highest score in the class in the third grade, and the teacher called me in and told me that. And that was the first achievement I ever had. I didn't know I could do anything. So I was a star at the Catholic school. We were a bunch of tough kids, most of them immigrants. Some of them spoke foreign languages at home. It was an Irish parish, but people were moving in that weren't Irish, and so we weren't all Irish. But we had a lot of Marys in the class, and so they'd have middle names like Mary Kay, Mary Ann, Mary Louise, and you'd have to use their whole name because which Mary are you talking about? So you could tell it was a Catholic school. They liked the name Mary. And my mother, with her name Marie, that was given to her by her parents. I think they thought it was a very American name. And her aunts, my mother's aunts, they'd be my great aunts, they always called her Mary. And I said, why do they call you Mary, Mom? And because your name is Marie. And so they know my name is Marie, but they think Marie is a kind of Mary, American Mary. So they thought my name. And she was the only Mary in the family that of all the girls that got named that. The 7 of them, none of them were really named Mary. So she was a devout Catholic, and my father too, and went to church every Sunday at Immaculate Conception Church. And so when after World War II, we had a priest, had been a chaplain in Europe, Father Kelly, and he was concerned that when he was in Europe, only the older women, grandmas, would bring their kids to the church, Catholic churches, and there weren't any men in the Catholic churches in Europe. And he said the Catholic Church is going to die. The men aren't going to church, and even their wives often aren't, and only grandma goes to church. He said, we've got to do something about this. So he formed what was called the Holy Name Society. Jesus was a man, and you're men, And this was a men's organization. And my father was elected treasurer of that. And my parents were very shy. And my father had never done any volunteer work at the church or anywhere. And he was the treasurer of the Holy Name Society. And he had to keep the books because he was a clerk at the post office and he knew about how to do paperwork. And so that was a important knowledge that I had, that my father was the treasurer. Anyway, on a Sunday in 1956, I was already married, and Kevin had been born, and we lived in Chillicothe, and I was teaching school there. So my mother went home to wake up my sisters to go to a later mass. They were sleeping in from a late Saturday night, and she went home to wake them up so they could go to the later mass. She went to the early mass because it was a communion. All the men went to communion together, and then they had breakfast. You didn't go to communion until you had to fast from midnight on. So guys could be drinking at a bar, and they'd look at the clock and, oh, it's almost midnight. They had to stop drinking. You couldn't eat or drink, and then they could go to communion the next morning on Sunday morning. So these men all went to the breakfast, and they're in the basement of the church. And my mother got into their car. Now this car, they had won as in a lottery. That was something. They won a car. Well, you bought lottery tickets, and they sold them to help pay for the church. The church was built in 1929 with a big mortgage, and then the Depression hit. So it was it did all kinds of things to raise money, had bazaars and cooks out things and to make money. And one of them was to have a raffle, and they raffled off a car. One of the members of the church was a Chevy dealer, so he would, I think, give them a Chevy at cost or maybe even pay for it. And then they'd have a new Chevy every year that they raffled off. Well, my parents were not gamblers. They didn't even buy lottery tickets, but this was a duty that they bought the tickets to help the church. So it was okay. Now, a lot of Protestants thought that lotteries were gambling, and gambling was a sin. But the Catholics didn't share that. They always had bingo halls that they used, and the people would pay to play bingo, which was considered a gambling game, and the Protestants didn't have those, so the Catholics kind of had a monopoly on the bingo, and they'd all make money that way. And the raffle. Now they didn't call it a lottery. That was something that was illegal. And you had to get permission. You had to be a charity in order to sell lottery tickets. And so they met the requirements of the state law where gambling was illegal. But a lottery for a church wasn't considered gambling. So my parents bought, I don't know, a handful of tickets and turned in the book. And they won. They won the Chevy. I think it was a 19. I can't remember how old it was. Now but it was a brand new car, and she drove it home all by herself. And this is irony, she was crossing the railroad tracks in this car after going to communion, and the car that she had won in the Catholic raffle, and the train hit the car and killed her. And so she died at 56 in this train accident. The first one of the DeVries girls, the oldest one, to die. And I was already teaching school in Chillicothe. And so I got a phone call from the family telling me that my mother had been killed and I should come home right away. So we went off to Waukegan for the funeral. That was the first funeral I think I ever went to. nobody in our family or any cousins or anything that I knew, nobody I was close to had died. And then my mother died, and I was already a grown father. But none of my children, Kevin was not even a year old. He was just an infant. He was born just a few months before she got killed. So none of my children know my mother, and none of the other girls are alive today. The last one died a few years ago at the age of 100. But nobody that's alive knew my mother, because she died so young. It was a real shock. And I had to go back to Chillicothe and finish out the year. And then I resigned and got a job in Elgin, Illinois, which was much closer to Waukegan, so I could be close to the family. And my father, now a widower, had to take care of the two girls. They were both teenagers. And so I wanted to be closer to home after that tragedy. But I think that's a story about how could that happen after going to communion and being in the lottery one car.
Yes.
Anyway, it happened. So we struggled on without my mother, and I think it affected my sisters. They both married and both divorced, and they had a hard time.
They were teenagers at the time, right?
They were teenagers, both of them. And so, I was like 26 and Kathy was 16, I think. And my other sister then was she was out of high school, but living at home and working. And so they had kind of a hard time. I think my mother was a really strong person and a wonderful person. But she did, I was her favorite. That's what the girls said. My sister said, but they would argue with my mother a lot. She'd try to tell them how to dress, and they felt controlled and they rebelled, and they didn't have a happy relationship during their teenage years the way I did. And when I went on to college, my parents said they couldn't afford to pay the mortgage on this nice house and send me to college. And anyway, the money would not be fair. The girls should get their share, and it shouldn't all go into my college education. I said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll take care of it." So I worked and saved. And the first year I went to a community college. It was actually set up because the University of Illinois, where I finally went, was so crowded with GIs from the GI Bill after World War II that they didn't have any room for me. So they set up these schools, and high school teachers would stay late. And when the high school was over, we would go in the evening or in the late afternoon, and we would have classes with high school teachers. It was a very good first introduction to college, and I could come home and live at home and get room and board and study. I'd get up and study at the card table in my bedroom, way up in the attic of the house where it was quiet. And I can remember studying, and I really liked college, even that first year. And so I was determined to go to University of Illinois. My buddy across the street, Gene Fourier, his father was a teacher, and they lived across the street. And he went and took a test at the county courthouse by the superintendent of schools, who was an office in the county. And he would give a scholarship to the University of Illinois if you got the highest score on the test. Well, he took the test, and he got the scholarship and got an engineering degree. But I didn't get the highest score when I took it, so I had to work my way through. But the tuition was only $100 a semester, and I could work bussing dishes in the dining room right at the hall where I lived, and then work in the summer, get a summer job. So I was able to work my way through, but it was a lot cheaper in college then than it is now, and I was very happy to be able to do that and get free room and board during the summer and then vacations when I came home. My parents did contribute that much, and they were cheerleaders. My mother, especially when I'd come home from college, she was so excited and wanted to know what I learned, what happened at college, and so on. So they were cheerleaders because neither one of them had. She went to a summer school at DeKalb, uh, Northern Illinois State Teachers College at DeKalb, Illinois, which was maybe 50 miles from Waukegan. And she went out to that summer school when she was teaching in the run room school. So she had one summer of college, I think. So that was my mother,
Yeah.
and she was wonderful to me, and
Oh,
I love her still.
well, that's a great story. Thank you very much for telling that.
That's good.
Yes.
That was really long, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that's okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay.